Hey, hello everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get started with the proceedings here, and I'll start off with the Zoom etiquette. So all the audience participants will be muted throughout the seminar. Please don't attempt to turn on your video or share your screen during the talk. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the talk, just like a normal seminar. So once the speaker has finished their talk, you can use the raised hand feature to notify me that you'd like to ask a question, and I'll call on people. The raise hand feature is located under the reactions tab at the bottom of the Zoom window. And when you ask a question, you're invited to turn on your video during your question. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Carl Lamborg. He's an expert in aquatic and atmospheric trace metal chemistry, particularly mercury, which we'll be talking about today. And he's interested in the biogeochemistry of mercury at a variety of time and space scales. So Carl started off with his PhD work at University of Connecticut, spent a while at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and then recently joined the faculty at UC Santa Cruz in 2014, so just down the road from us. And so today, Carl will be presenting his talk on mercury and what we can learn about the ocean using mercury. So take it away, Carl.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everybody for coming. I had sort of grander plans, I think, when I sent the title, which was, I guess, good because it sort of set me off on trying to think about some other ways in which to use mercury as a proxy. And but then I decided as the talk time got closer that maybe some of those ideas were just a little kind of half-baked. So I'm gonna give you only unfortunately, one example of a way in which I think mercury is a really interesting proxy for some ocean processes. And then extend that proxy, I think, into a couple of different timescales in the geologic past, and see what that tells us about how the mercury cycles operated back then, and also maybe something about how the mercury cycle might be operating in our future as well. And so mysteriously, well, I'll talk about some of these things. This is the Deccan traps right here, and hydrothermal volcanic or submarine volcanic activity, and also glaciers. I wanted to thank several people who helped me in particular on this, developing this talk, collecting data, thinking about the science in a variety of ways. One is a former postdoc of mine, Paul Drevnik, who's now up in Alberta. Zosha Bauman, who's a research scientist at the University of Connecticut working with Rob Mason. Frankie Pavia, who is now postdoc at University of Southern California, but was a graduate student at Lamont when we were putting some of these ideas together. And then my current postdoc and research scientist, Caitlin Bowman, right there on a cruise, and my former lab technician, Gretchen Swar, who's still at Woods Hole. And then also I want to thank my current students, Xinyan Cui and Nettie Kalman, who listened to me practice this talk earlier today. They unfortunately did not have a hand in some of the stuff I'm talking about today, but they're doing also very interesting mercury-related research nearby, and I'm happy to talk about that stuff as well if you all are interested. Okay, so there are many people around the world who are working on studying the Mercury cycle, and many of them are actually at Moss Landing. Down in the, what's the lab closer to Mbari called? I forget there's a name for that.
Called Norte.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Westheim and all of his folks are really active mercury researchers in the area. And then there have been some graduate students I know who used to work with Kenneth Gold as well. So Moss Landing is definitely at the center of mercury research worldwide as well. So why would any of us who are doing this mercury research, why would we care about mercury in general? The main reason why people are concerned with mercury is that it's, of course, toxic and accumulates in seafood, to potentially hazardous levels for people and wildlife that eat seafood. And another part of it is that human beings have had a big impact on the mercury cycle. We have been putting a lot of mercury out into the world by primarily through the process of burning coal and also through gold mining. And so we've had a big impact on the scope and cycling of mercury around the Earth. And this has then enhanced the threat to human and environmental health by boosting the amount of mercury that's moving around the planet today. So that's sort of the main driver for a lot of the mercury research. I'm going to talk about stuff today that's tangentially related to that, only partially related to that. And I'm going to try and use mercury as an interesting proxy for a couple of things that have operated in the Earth history, primarily what the drivers of glacial interglacial change have been, and then also maybe some understanding of these so-called large igneous provinces and the mass extinctions associated with large igneous provinces. I had hoped to also talk a little bit about how mercury helps us understand the biological pump, but that would be a talk for another day. By the way, please interrupt me if you all have questions. I don't know if that's the normal style here, but I'm happy to entertain questions as we go on. Okay, so the glacial interglacial part of the story goes a little bit like this. And I'm by no means an expert in climate change sort of stuff. So this is things that I've learned to try and get up to speed with some of this research. But we know that there have been glacial interglacial changes in the last million years or so. And the tempo of those changes between colder glacial states and warmer interglacial states is largely controlled by the so-called Milankovitch cycles, which I'm sure you all are familiar with, the variations in Earth's orbital parameters that gives us sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less sunlight. And that's enough to drive Earth's climate into and out of warmer and colder states. But those Milankovitch cycles sort of overlap on each other and interact with each other, giving rise to changes in insolation that are basically sort of smooth. They look like sort of sine waves, or like a tide graph or something like that. But their real temperature records look more like a sawtooth kind of pattern. Shown here, this is taken from a paper that I'm going to show you more data from later on. So this isn't necessarily the quintessential temperature record recently, but this is a deuterium-based temperature reconstruction over the last 500,000 years or so ago from Antarctic ice, from Dome C, which is in East Antarctica. And the general pattern that one sees here is, as you go from an interglacial state, a warm interglacial state, we sort of slowly slip into colder and colder conditions, and then suddenly pop out of glacial states and into the next interglacial state. But the insolation forcing is not like that at all. It's more or less smooth. So why do we have a sawtooth climate pattern when the forcing is sort of non-sawtooth shape? And a couple of people have suggested that maybe part of this has to do with volcanic activity. And the initial suggestion was, well, maybe it has something to do with as the climate starts to warm up, all the ice that's up on land, that's sort of suppressing, that's sitting on top of volcanoes and that sort of stuff, as that weight begins to be lifted off of volcanoes, maybe volcanoes are suddenly sort of stimulated, and a whole bunch of carbon dioxide is spat into the atmosphere, which then accelerates the warming that's already begun. And I think the Mercury data has something to tell us about that hypothesis, actually. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit more background just on Mercury in general. Mercury is an unusual metal in that it has a very prominent, very important gas phase component to its cycling. It's fairly volatile for metal, has a lifetime in the atmosphere of something like half a year. It's primarily in the atmosphere in the form of elemental mercury, the same kind of thing that's in thermometers. It's slowly oxidized to mercuric ion, mercury 2, which is much, much less volatile, falls out of the atmosphere, lands in water and on land. Once in the water, it can undergo a bunch of different kinds of biogeochemical reactions, some of which result in the formation of organomercury compounds, monomethylmercury and dimethylmercury. We think a lot of this is driven by biology, but a lot of the chemistry behind this is still kind of mysterious. This is very important chemical reaction because it's those series of reactions that give rise to the most bioaccumulative forms of mercury, the monomethyl mercury form. So this is the chemical reaction that drives ultimately the part of the mercury cycle that we're also worried about, which is the bioaccumulation part. But another really important and actually sort of dominant chemical reaction is the re-reduction of mercury 2 back to elemental mercury. And this reaction happens really, really strongly enough that actually elemental mercury builds up in surface waters to supersaturated levels. And so mercury bubbles back out of the ocean again into the atmosphere as elemental mercury. And the flux of mercury 0 from the water back into the atmosphere is about the same as the flux of mercury 2 into the water associated with deposition. So this is one big major sort of sub-cycle in the overall cycle in the formation of these methylated forms. It's sort of a minority part of the overall movement of the metal, but of course very important from a toxicology point of view. Human beings have dramatically changed the cycling of mercury through burning fossil fuels, primarily coal, and also using mercury in other kinds of applications like gold mining. There was a lot of mercury was mined in California. Actually, there was more mercury mined in California during the gold rush than there was gold, because mercury is used in sort of low-level, low-tech gold mining that was common and sort of prevalent in the late 1800s. And we can see that signal, the signal from gold mining during the late 1800s is less prominent than the current industrial-based signal, and we can see this from reconstructions of mercury deposition from the atmosphere to lakes using lake cores that we collect, section, date, and then measure the mercury concentration in the sediments and then reconstruct flux from that. And so here, just using a couple of cores as an example from New Zealand and from the North Slope of Alaska in the green and blue dots. And you can see that the deposition of mercury to those particular lakes was pretty constant for at least as far back as our record goes in sort of the mid 1500s until the Industrial Revolution, when then all of a sudden the deposition starts to increase. And if we normalize to these sort of the oldest part of these cores, I'd call that 1, you can see that currently the deposition has been enhanced. Actually, this is kind of old data now, it only goes to 2000. That we've increased the amount of mercury moving around the planet by about a factor of 3 or something like that. So a major impact to the global mercury cycle. And the connection to industrial activity is clear by comparing how CO2 has also changed at the same time. You can see that the timing of the mercury increase and the CO2 increases are virtually the same. Closer to industrial sources, there's been a diminishment. So these are 2 lake sediment cores from the Petaquamscut River estuary in Rhode Island, and then Oyster Pond on Cape Cod, just right next to Woods Hole. And you can see that in the pre-industrial era, that the deposition of mercury was kind of slow, and then the Industrial Revolution came along, and all of a sudden there was a big peak in mercury deposition locally, but then it's sort of subsided. So this here was a massive increase of the amount of mercury being deposited locally, factor of 14 or something over the pre-industrial values. And they have relaxed back down to something like this global average of about a factor of 3 or so. And this was all associated with Cape Cod at the time, and New England was burning a lot of coal just for home heating, until oil became really prevalent in the post-World War II world. But oil and natural gas became really prevalent. So there are some parts of the world where deposition of mercury is decreasing as a result of sort of cleaning up our act, but those are generally sort of localized. Yeah, I think I said all that. So about a factor of 3 increase globally during the Anthropocene. And where did all that mercury end, or where is all that mercury, all this pollution mercury that we put out? Well, I drew an analogy to carbon dioxide earlier as a result of the timing. And because mercury also moves around the planet as this relatively long-lived gas, we might expect that the accumulation of mercury in the ocean, for example, mimics that of carbon dioxide to some extent. And you're probably all familiar with this work from Chris Sabine and others where they, as a result of driving around, collecting DIC and pH and PCO2 and all sorts of different carbonate measurements over the years, were able to reconstruct where they think all the anthropogenic carbon dioxide is in the ocean. And not surprisingly, a lot of it is in the North Atlantic, because that's where deep water formation occurs. And so it's sucking enhanced CO2 and surface waters deeper down into the ocean. And we found, by looking at profiles of mercury in various locations in the Earth that we collected associated with the GeoTraces program, that mercury has sort of a similar kind of pattern. And we were able to come up then with an estimate of where all the pollution mercury is in the ocean, sort of through analogy with, with carbon dioxide. And we found that the surface waters of the ocean have been enhanced by something like 3.5. So there's 3.5 times more mercury in the surface ocean today than there was pre-industrially. The thermocline waters have increased by about a factor of 2.5. And then deep waters, primarily in the North Atlantic, have increased by only about 10%. So there's a part of the ocean, the deep part of the ocean, especially deep Pacific Ocean, is more or less untouched by human activity with respect to mercury, but the surface ocean is very heavily impacted. And of course, that's where all the biology is. So there's great potential for mercury to accumulate in biology, a greater extent of mercury accumulation today than pre-industrial. Okay, so I'm going to shift. That's sort of the current state of things. I just wanted to give you some context about how much human beings have perturbed the mercury cycle, because I want to draw some comparisons now to what happened during the last glacial cycle, and the last glacial max in particular. And this is data collected mercury concentrations in Antarctic ice from a similar ice from the same ice core that I showed you a little bit of data before earlier from the Dome Sea ice. This is the same EPICA program. This particular core was collected just before the EPICA program, but it's the same location that the EPICA cores were collected from in Dome Sea. The samples were provided. So these are the result of analyses by Grace Vandal and Bill Fitzgerald, my old colleagues at the University of Connecticut. Bill was my PhD advisor, and Grace was my fellow lab member. I actually joined the lab just after they published this paper. And these were ice samples that they got in collaboration with Claude Bertrand, who's now retired, but was at the University of Grenoble in France. And what they found was that the concentration of mercury in Antarctic ice from Dome Sea over the last glacial cycle was maybe 100,000 years long or something like that. But right here at sort of last glacial maximum, just before deglaciation, which was around maybe 25,000 years ago or something like that, the concentration of mercury in that ice went up by a factor of 5 or something, and seemed that that increase in the mercury concentration in the ice seemed to sort of peak out during last glacial maximum. And their explanation for this was that they thought, well, during glacial times, during glacial states, the ocean is more productive than during interglacial states as a result of a lot of potentially, as we all know from John Martin's work, potentially a lot of iron going into the ocean, so on and so forth. So more productive ocean around Antarctica would have also given rise to more production of biogenically related gases like dimethyl sulfide. They also saw a peak in non-sea salt sulfate, and that's what this dotted line is here. And through analogy with the evasion of dimethyl sulfide into the ocean, into the atmosphere from the ocean, they said, well, maybe there's more mercury evasion from the ocean happening at the same time as a consequence, somehow as a consequence of increased primary productivity taking place. And by using, say, the ratio of mercury to dimethyl sulfide evasion taking place today, and using dimethyl sulfide as a proxy, then they came up with an estimate for what the increase in mercury deposition ought to have been. And that's what the dotted line is, using dimethyl sulfide as a proxy. And it matched pretty well what they actually saw in the ice for the mercury data. So they thought, we figured this out. We're good to go. A few years later, Jataro and others, and this is where the deuterium data I showed you earlier came from, the paper that deuterium data came from, went farther back, and they went back 600, 700,000 years or something. So back over several recent glacial cycles. And they saw that every time, so this would have been the time frame that Bill and Grace's data came from. But if they went farther back in time, every time there was a glacial state, as indicated here as an increase in dust deposition to the cores, they saw an increase in the mercury concentration. So it wasn't just the last glacial maximum. It seems to have occurred every time there was a glacial maximum in the past. You would see these peaks in mercury accumulation in Antarctic ice. By the way, and speaking about dust, it wasn't just increased dust fluxes that resulted in increased mercury concentrations in the ice, because we know reasonably well what the mercury to, say, aluminum ratio is in dust. And by looking at the aluminum concentration in that Antarctic ice, you can come up with an estimate for how much of the increase in mercury deposition was dust derived or dust caused. And it's small, it's relatively small and can't explain these big peaks that you see in the mercury accumulation. So it's coincident with the dust deposition, but not caused by the dust deposition, increased dust deposition. Jatara et al. Came up with a different explanation. I'm not sure why they felt the need to come up with a different explanation, but they thought, we think that maybe the increase in mercury deposition is a consequence of changes in the atmospheric chemistry over Antarctic during interglacial and glacial states. Mercury actually has a slightly shorter residence time in the atmosphere when the air is really cold. And they thought, well, during a cold state, mercury is just coming out of the air faster. And so that gives you increased deposition as a consequence. When Paul Drevnik arrived at Hui as a postdoc, he had also done a fair amount of work on mercury sort of paleolimnology and was really interested in reconstructing mercury changes in the past. And he noticed that there is some really interesting cores in the Hui core repository, core lab, including a core from Lake Titicaca, which is up in the Andes in Bolivia. And Lake Titicaca has persisted over many glacial cycles, been around for a long time. So sediments from Lake Titicaca actually extend back through the last glacial maximum. Unlike, you can't get lake sediments like that from North America anywhere, because all those lakes are basically have only existed since the last glacial maximum. So you wouldn't be able to go, or since the last glacial retreat, so you can't go back through back 25 or 30,000 years or something like that to see if it happened in other locations. But Paul and I got really curious about whether or not we could see this increase in mercury deposition in other locations around the globe, or whether this was just happening in Antarctica, as Bill and Grace and Jatara et al. Have documented. So I'm going to show you some data from Lake Baikal up here in Siberia, also data from Lake Titicaca. And then also we got a little bit of, after we started getting into this and getting sort of interested, we got a little bit of money from Hui to go get some ice samples from the National Ice Core Lab in Denver, and that were collected as part of the Greenland Ice Sheet project, and look to see whether the similar kinds of changes occurred in Arctic ice that people were seeing in Antarctic ice. Arctic ice doesn't necessarily go back as far in time as Antarctic ice does, but at least goes certainly back through the last glacial cycle. Okay, so I'll step through this and show you a little bit of the data piece by piece. Here's the results from Lake Titicaca that Paul analyzed. And the timing looks a little bit different, but definitely we see a big increase in the amount of mercury accumulation in Lake Titicaca. That's the brown and the red data when compared, and it's sort of similar to, in magnitude anyway, to the Dome C Antarctic ice signal. And this is all sort of normalized to the Holocene data. So they're more or less on the same sort of scale here. So timing is a little bit different, but definitely the signal is showing up in Lake Titicaca. And this really put us back in our chairs when we first saw this, because this means then that this was not, this increase in mercury deposition that Bill and Grace and Jatara saw in Antarctica was not just a local Antarctic phenomenon. This is something that seemed to be happening maybe at least hemispheric wide in the Southern Hemisphere, which sort of changes, and then you really have to start thinking about sort of global mass balance of mercury to see if we can explain this sort of thing. If it's real localized just around Antarctica, then changes in residence time or evasion from the Southern Ocean can sort of explain the phenomenon that you see. But if it's happening worldwide to this large an extent, that sort of has the potential to invalidate some of the earlier hypotheses about what caused this mercury perturbation. So we also then went and got some Antarctic or Arctic ice, as I mentioned before. Here is the concentration we measured in Arctic ice over the last sort of 40,000 years or so. And also there were some, Claude Boutron, Bill, and Grace were also involved in analyzing some snow pit samples from the GISP site as well. And found, so these are sort of contemporary concentrations today, and you can see that they're similar to, there's maybe a little bit of an enhancement during the last glacial maximum in concentration. But of course, the flux of mercury, the flux of water during the last glacial maximum was quite low. Glacial states are really dry. So even though the concentration went up a little bit, the flux of mercury actually went down. So if we normalize then to Holocene fluxes of mercury and compare, and also calculate the fluxes of mercury to Antarctica, you see that Antarctica and the Arctic, now in red, look radically different. So there was a big increase in the mercury deposition in Antarctica, but essentially no signal or even a suppression of mercury deposition to the Arctic during the last glacial maximum. So the two hemispheres seem to be, the mercury cycle in the two hemispheres seems to have been very, very different. Lake Baikal also showed a sort of similar data as well. These are from Paul's work as well. So here's the last glacial maximum. This is when we saw a peak in mercury deposition in Antarctica. And if anything, again, we saw maybe a little bit of a suppression of mercury deposition to Lake Baikal. Excuse me. Okay, so I tried to model this a little bit very crudely using a very simple, but interesting and potentially powerful 3-box model that Helen Amos, who is a graduate student with Elsie Sunderland at Harvard, had developed to try and understand contemporary mercury cycling. And so what I did was to try and mimic the 3 different hypotheses. One, which is basically the Grace and Bill's hypothesis, which is increased evasion of mercury from the ocean. I basically turned off all deposition of mercury so all burial of mercury to the bottom of the ocean, which would then force an increase in evasion because the mercury would have nowhere else to go. And then to mimic the Jataro et al. Hypothesis, in the model, I decreased the resonance time of mercury as low as I could go, and which meant increasing the decreasing the resonance time, increasing the reaction rate, but decreasing the resonance time from instead of 6 months down to a month and a half or something like that. And I couldn't drive it any lower because the model began to sort of blow up if I tried to use a resonance time any shorter than about a month and a half. And then I tested out a third hypothesis, which is maybe we actually need to add extra mercury to the system, that we can't explain any of these things that we're seeing without invoking some increased source. And here, if we turn up evasion from the ocean by turning down ocean burial, we see a little bit of an increase in mercury burial compared to interglacial. What we're trying to reconstruct is this dotted line up here. That's the enhancement of deposition that we observe in Lake Titicaca and Dome Sea ice. If we increase the deposition rate of mercury over terrestrial environment here by decreasing the resonance time, we also get a big boost in deposition compared to interglacial times, and a little but a decrease in deposition to the ocean. But again, it's still not quite enough. And so it looks like neither of these hypotheses, at least by themselves, is adequate to explain the boost in the mercury signal that we see in these archives. And what I had to do in order to get the model to reconstruct by only turning one knob, I had to turn up the primary flux of mercury into the system through volcanism by over 5 times of what it is today, or so, to get that big increase. I should have pointed out, I'm just going to back up for a second. I should have pointed out here that this accumulation rate in Antarctica, as shown here by Dome Sea, is the same as the kind of signal that we see today. This is about a factor of 3 increase or so. So the perturbation, the interglacial to glacial difference in the way the mercury cycle operates is as large as the anthropogenic perturbation is today, which is large, factor of 3 or something like that. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. Okay, so there's only one natural source of mercury that we know of anyway, which is volcanism. And one possibility, as the climate people had suggested, is that, well, maybe there was during glacial maximum, there was this big boost in subaerial volcanism that then gave rise to a whole lot of extra carbon dioxide that then allowed the glaciers to melt that much faster. But we didn't see a mercury deposition signal increase in the Arctic ice, for example, or in Lake Baikal. And if subaerial volcanism was responsible for that big pop of carbon dioxide, then we should have seen a mercury signal in those records, because a lot of the volcanism is in the Northern Hemisphere. But we saw no signal like that at all. So that, I think that rules out this idea that subaerial volcanism was part of this reason why we pop out of glacial states and into an interglacial state. So the only other sort of remaining possibility then is increased submarine volcanism and submarine hydrothermal circulation as a result. So let's explore that as a possible explanation for these mercury signals, and also maybe climate signals. First of all, do we know whether or not mercury, there is elevated mercury in hydrothermal fluids? And the answer is yes. We don't have a huge data set here now, but when I was at Hui, we got some samples through generous donations from colleagues who were involved in the Ridge 2000 program. Some of you may be familiar with. So we got samples from the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, from the East Pacific Rise at 9 North, from the Back Arc Basin and Lao Basin, and from our closer to home Juan de Fuca and Gorda Ridge spreading centers. And so we see at these different locations, yes, they're elevated above the sort of typical 1 picomolar mercury concentration. Some of them, like Lao Basin, were maybe just a little bit enhanced above that. And then some of them, like the Rainbow vent field on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, were really boosted by a factor of 100 or more above the ambient mercury concentration. So definitely fluids can be enriched in mercury, maybe not uniformly at every hydrothermal or submarine volcanism location, but definitely high in various places. One interesting side note is that the fluids coming out of EPR and Mid-Atlantic Ridge have basically no methyl mercury in them, whereas the fluids coming out of Lao Basin and Seacliff were, although maybe not super high in total mercury, were essentially 100% monomethyl mercury. And both of those locations were sedimented. So maybe this has something to do with hot fluids coming up through mud and sort of stimulating bacterial activity, giving rise to lots of methyl mercury. That remains a sort of open question that would be interesting to explore. Okay, so there's mercury is kind of high in fluids, but why might there be a peak in mercury in submarine volcanic activity during the last glacial maximum? And a couple of people have gotten into this, and I've been mostly schooled by Dave Lund at University of Connecticut and other people as well. But the general idea is that during glacial states, of course, you're moving a lot of water from the ocean up onto land to create glaciers. That's water that normally would melt each year if in a warmer climate, melt, run downhill, and then back in the ocean again. But of course, during cold states, you're just building up ice. And so you're moving water from the ocean up onto land. And as a result, you're lowering sea level really dramatically, as we all know. So much so that maybe sea level during last glacial maximum was something like 300 meters lower than it is today. And because you've lowered sea level by 300 meters, that means you've removed a lot of weight from on top of places like mid-ocean ridges, where a lot of volcanism happens. And by removing some of that weight, it allows rock in those situations to melt more easily, and therefore give rise to a greater volcanic activity along mid-ocean ridges, certainly, and maybe other locations as well. This is evidenced by, you can see, for example, you can see pulses in seafloor spreading rates that coincide with Milankovitch cycles as well. So there's other additional evidence to the kind of stuff I'm going to show you later on that shows that this is a real thing, that this is happening. So this is, there's a stimulated volcanic activity during glacial maximum. And it makes sense that it's, maybe there's even sort of a tipping point kind of thing, which is that as sea level drops, maybe there's not a huge increase in volcanic activity until the sea level gets really low, like at glacial maximum, and then seafloor spreading really and submarine volcanic activity really speeds up. I'm not an expert in any of this kind of stuff, so I welcome all the geologists in the audience to please educate me on any of this kind of stuff. Okay, so it's not just Mercury that's being affected in this way. This is data from Dave Lund, looking at the trace metal concentrations of sediments from around these hydrothermal vent systems that are now extinct, but that were at parts of the seafloor that were at the ridge at the ridge crest at the time that the last glacial maximum happened. What you see is increased fluxes of things like manganese and iron, things that are coming out of hydrothermal, that we know are coming out of hydrothermal vents also. So this is another sort of geochemical evidence of increased submarine hydrothermal activity and submarine volcanism in general. What's weird about Dave's data, though, is, and this is a potential problem for my hypothesis, is that the timing of the mercury increase and the timing of the iron and manganese increase are different. So the trace metal data seems to suggest an increase in hydrothermal activity during basically late glacial maximum and then into deglaciation, whereas the mercury data shown the timing of the mercury maxima, which is in this yellow, denoted by this yellow bar, is sort of really centered on last glacial maximum and begins to tail off during deglaciation as well. So they both seem to maybe be responding to changes in hydrothermal activity, but the timing of the two are not precisely the same. And mercury seems to precede the iron and manganese signals. Another problem then we have to sort of solve is why would there be a southern hemispheric mercury signal and not a global? Well, Mercury's resonance time is relative. It's long enough to give you good mixing within a hemisphere, but it's not good. It's not long enough to really give you adequate mixing between the hemispheres. The sort of characteristic mixing time between hemispheres is something like a year, and Mercury resonance time is like half a year or something like that, maybe even a little shorter. So if we had a source in the southern hemisphere, that might explain why we see a big pulse of mercury depositing to places like Lake Titicaca and Dome C, but not in the Arctic. And this was just a sort of thought experiment done by Al Talibouy and Joe Reesing to try and explain. That was as a result of some geotraces sampling as well. They were trying to think about, okay, where is hydrothermal iron showing up in the surface ocean today? If hydrothermal iron is a really important source of iron that maybe we've neglected, where does that iron make its way to the surface ocean and then make itself felt in biology? And so they took then this is a histogram of where all the different densities of where hydrothermal venting is occurring around the world. And some of it's real shallow, some of it's real deep, but sort of the most of it is happening around a sigma theta value of something like 27.8. And then they said, well, okay, where does 27.8 outcrop in today's ocean? And today's ocean, it outcrops right along Antarctica. So Antarctica is the first place where deep water, really deep water, the water of the depth where hydrothermal venting tends to take place. It's the first place in the world ocean where something released into the deep water associated with hydrothermal vent would have an opportunity to come in contact with the atmosphere. So in the case of Mercury, the first place where it would have an opportunity to evade from the ocean and then be deposited on land somewhere like in Antarctica. But there is one major caveat. So I'm starting to feel good. This a lot of the dots are starting to kind of connect together for this Mercury submarine, Mercury as a proxy for submarine hydrothermal activity in the geologic past. But we got a major fly in the ointment, which is when we look at where hydrothermal mercury ends up in today's ocean, we find that it looks like it's falling out of the water pretty near field and is not making its way in sort of universally into the deep ocean. And this is in contrast. Now, this is data from Joe Reesing, who was inspired to do that earlier thought experiment with Al Talibouy. He measured iron, manganese, aluminum, and in collaboration with other folks, excess helium-3, which is a tracer of hydrothermal inputs into the ocean. They saw these plumes, basically. So this is along the East Pacific Rise, excuse me, in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, where you had a lot of hydrothermal fluids entering the ocean, you had these big peaks in the dissolved iron, manganese, aluminum, and helium taking place. And then you could even see this plume of stuff sort of blowing downwind because the deep water circulation flows from east to west in this particular location. But when we turn to look at dissolved total mercury in the same location, pardon me, and this is data then from Caitlin Bowman's PhD work, you see that maybe there's a hint of a mercury plume here. It's definitely not as prominent as the iron, manganese, aluminum, and helium plumes are, which seems to suggest that if there's a lot of mercury coming out of EPR in this location, it's probably being deposited to the sediments close to where it's being dumped in. So then we have to come up with some sort of explanation for why during the last glacial maximum, maybe a lot of mercury was able to make its way sort of into the wider deep ocean and escape being deposited close to the vents where it was put into the ocean in the first place. So anyway, I put this up because I was sort of inspired by some encouraging words of my PhD advisor, Bill Fitzgerald. I would often come to him. I would say, well, we had some hypothesis or something. I would run an experiment. I'd come back to him and I'd say, oh, it didn't work. It didn't give us the answer that we expected. And he would always say, oh no, this is really exciting. If there's an inconsistency, there has to be a really interesting explanation. So this is great. He would get really excited when I would come to him with what I thought was a failed experiment. He'd like, no, this is great. So we got this major inconsistency. The core data seems to suggest that we need a big input of mercury during the last glacial maximum to explain the signals we see. And the timing and the distribution of mercury deposition seems consistent with big increases in hydrothermal inputs of mercury. But there's a problem, which is that today anyway, mercury seems to fall out of the water way too fast and can't last long enough in the water to actually make its way to Antarctica and be upwelled and then evade into the atmosphere. So these are something we have to come up with. I won't belabor some of the ideas of why I think this might be happening, but maybe there's some possible resolutions to this. I can talk more about that if you're all interested. I should probably keep moving now. So anyway, I'm hopeful anyway that at some point, maybe we can resolve these sorts of things. And the potential here is that maybe Mercury is telling us something about how the ocean was changing during last glacial maximum and going into deglaciation. Is it telling us something about ocean circulation? Is it telling us something about how extra carbon dioxide was put into the system that helped us pop out of the last glacial maximum and into the next interglacial state? We have some bugs to work out in this hypothesis, but maybe it's telling us something that we can't get any other way. Maybe Mercury is a proxy for how the ocean operates that we can't get any other way. That's my hope anyway. Now I want to shift a little quickly. I'll just go over this because this is super speculative. But moving back farther in time, people have gotten really excited about using Mercury as a proxy for volcanism in deeper time. There have been times in Earth's history when there was so much volcanic activity that huge areas of igneous rock were emplaced in over relatively short geologic periods. And these are called the so-called large igneous provinces, or LIPs. And in sediment records, at the same time when you see an LIP, you also often see big mercury excursions, mercury accumulation, changes in mercury accumulation with big peaks in mercury accumulation taking place. And people are exploring this and also kind of using mercury as a way to prospect for times in Earth's history when there might have been other LIP events that we don't necessarily have a rock record for, that anybody's found a rock record for. And there's a lot of, and also it helps sort of maybe gauge in an independent kind of way what the extent of some of these LIP events were. But one thing that's particularly interesting about these LIPs is that they were also associated, many of them anyway, are associated with the 5 big extinction events that have happened in Earth's history, like the KT boundary and the Permian extinctions and all these sorts of things, were times in Earth's history when large percentages of the biodiversity were wiped out on Earth. And at the same time, there was an LIP happening on Earth. And people are exploring then whether there could be a possible connection between LIPs and the extinction events, whether one caused the other. I won't belabor this data too much because this is a little bit extrapolated, this sort of pretty tentative, and I want to leave a lot of time for questions. But So today, we're certainly worried about, I guess I should point out that during some of these LIP excursions, the Mercury cycle was perturbed by factors of 2 to 12 or something like that. So comparable to today's big pollution perturbation, and also as big or bigger than the glacial interglacial transition as well that we've seen. And we're worried about toxicity of organisms today, and the effects of mercury pollution on the various food webs, our exposure, but also exposure to food webs, and whether it's affecting fish productivity and seabird productivity and so on and so forth, and marine mammals and everybody that eats fish in the ocean. So gosh, if these LIPs were associated with even bigger perturbations of the Mercury cycle, maybe the Mercury cycle, perturbation of Mercury cycle was somehow even not just accidentally connected with the extinction events, but maybe they played a role in the extinction events. So it'd be really interesting to try and reconstruct this. I'm exploring the idea of kind of looking to see how much during the glacial interglacial transitions happened, how much of that mercury made its way into marine food webs as well, by looking at, for example, mummified seals in collaboration with Paul Koch. But then also it'd be really interesting to look for ways to see if we can figure out if a lot more mercury made it into the food webs during some of these deeper time LIP type events. Then there's not really any biological remains to sort of direct biological remains to go after for that. So we need some sort of a hard part, maybe from an organism. And some people are starting to explore whether or not mercury in shells of bivalves, for example, could be part of that. And I'll show you a little bit of data about that right now. So this is a paper, a couple of year old paper now. This is the concentration of mercury in bivalve shells collected in a number of different locations that represent different periods of time in Earth's history. These are modern mollusks, and then here going farther back in time as well, including Maastricht. I can't even say this time. Maastrichtian. Pardon, please, biologists or geologists, excuse my mangling of this name. But this period of time was when there was an LIP going on, in particular the Deccan Traps. This is a major LIP area in India. So we see today, for example, that shells that come from sort of the pre-industrial past have concentrations that lie sort of within this dark gray area. Shells that have been collected more that represent sort of proposed modern background kinds of concentrations, not right near a pollution source, might have concentrations in the shells kind of like this. This is in parts per billion, for example, of mercury weight to weight. So above 1 part per million, for example, might be what you would expect to find in a mollusk or bivalve today. And then shells that were collected from organisms that are right downwind of like direct pollution sources today in the South River in Virginia have really high concentrations, maybe going up to 10 to 100 parts per billion, something like that. And if we turn our attention then to older times, what we see is that during this Deccan Traps LIP period of time, you see sometimes shells that have these super high kinds of concentrations of mercury in the shells, comparable to shells today that are right downstream of some major industrial input of mercury. So it's very possible, I think, that during LIPs, there was a lot of mercury flowing into marine food webs, and maybe that played some part in the loss of biodiversity, at least in marine ecosystems. Okay, so in summary, humans have changed the mercury cycle by a factor of 3 or more in today's world, and there are human environmental health concerns associated with that. The mercury cycle was also perturbed during the last glacial maximum, and seems like the previous glacial maxima as well. And my working hypothesis is that this is associated with increases in submarine volcanism and hydrothermal circulation, and may have found its way into wildlife as well. And it's interesting to think about how organisms maybe would have coped with that increased mercury loading. And then even in deeper time, associated with these large igneous provinces, maybe they were faced by an even larger and even more threatening flux of mercury into marine food webs as well. And again, it's sort of interesting to think about how the fauna may have had to cope with that kind of threat. And maybe they didn't. Maybe that was a contributor to some of these extinctions in the deep past. So I think about thinking about these deeper past kind of things maybe will help us think about where the Mercury cycle might be going into the future and how much our perturbations of the Mercury cycle might affect sustainability of marine food webs as we move forward. So thanks a lot. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Carl. Happy to take questions. Again, you can use the raise hand feature under the reactions tab, or if you put a question in the chat, we can find that as well. And it's like we have Ivano Aiello has a question.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm on my phone, so I'm not sure what is working.
No worries.
Hey, Carl, thank you so much for the presentations. It's very exciting, and I'm sure that we can continue this conversation later on. I was wondering. I mean, you actually kind of started this interpretation at the very end of your talk. When I saw your Mercury data from the last glacial maximum and the asymmetric increase or the lack of increase in the northern hemisphere and the increase in the southern hemisphere, my head went to the seesaw mechanism that we know very much about in terms of circulation as well as extent of sea ice. And so I kind of like to have you expand on that a little bit, because if you go back to your earlier hypothesis, which is that the increase in mercury could be due to an increase in degasification, if that's the right expression.
Sure.
Could it be possible that, I mean, essentially doing the last glacial maximum, much of the northern hemisphere was ice-locked, right? So you had this lid on top of the ocean, which actually collapsed very rapidly, which looks very much like your Mercury data during deglaciation. So I wonder whether one potential explanation is that there was no as much gas exchange essentially in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And I also have sort of blowing off all the discussion about how meridional overturning circulation may or may not change. Right. So I think that's a really great point. I turned back to, and my point of departure, I think was, whoops, I skipped it, sorry, was this quick modeling, which seemed to suggest that just by turning on or off, or turning down or up the evasion of mercury from the ocean or not, and that kind of stuff, didn't seem like it was enough to sort of just moving the mercury we already had in the ocean around into different locations didn't seem to provide an adequate explanation for the big signal that we saw in Antarctica. But the modeling that I did was sort of an all or nothing kind of scenario. And maybe it's some combination of things, like you're saying, like if you decrease some evasion in the northern hemisphere and you increase the inputs a little bit in submarine volcanism or something like that, maybe that, some combination of all of the above kind of scenario might explain things as well.
Yeah. No, and it's really interesting because the hypothesis that sea level change and sea level drop could enhance melting in the mantle and enhance volcanism, and then you get into the feedback process, which is really an intriguing idea. So we've been trying to test that. So there's not really a good, I mean, it's a great idea, but it's still very hypothetical. So so some people, including us being Christina Roel, who worked with you there, we tried to link volcanic ash concentration in the submarine record to glacial interglacial, kind of test this idea. And in the Bering Sea, which is a great place to look for. but we couldn't really see any correlation. So I know that there are different people that come up with different ways to look at it, because you do have underwater volcanism. So actually you have land volcanism and underwater volcanism. So you're moving mass from one place to another. You're denuding land, you know what I'm saying? So it's still not really supported by empirical evidence, as far as I know, but it's intriguing indeed.
We were also talking, my students and I were also talking earlier today, like, well, if there have been these changes in the fluxes in and maybe redistribution of mercury, shouldn't that show up in marine sediments as well?
Right.
And that's something we don't, like, not just the ash story that you're suggesting as well, but, you know, in places maybe not near a hydrothermal vent, et cetera, or near volcanism of one kind or another. And we just don't have that data. And that's really, you know, I guess we just should write a proposal. And, you know, those, I gather those kinds of sediments are out in the world to be analyzed. So it's not like we have to go collect new things, but yeah.
We have plenty of sediments from the oceans. If you need any, just come to our warehouse.
Okay.
And but so I don't want to take too much longer. Thank you so much. And by the way, Caitlin Bowen was one of our visiting scientists, right?
Of course, that's right. I forgot to mention you all.
Yeah. So she was here for a year. It was wonderful to have her here. And
yeah, she loved it. She loved the planet Muslim.
Thank you, Carl.
My pleasure.
Great. Actually, I had a question about the Southern Hemisphere sites where it looked like the Lake Titicaca and Antarctica, they didn't quite line up in time. Yeah. So there's, I guess it peaked earlier and then stopped. So is there I guess a circulation explanation for that, or?
That's a great question. I don't know. We were a little surprised actually that Titicaca gave us this kind of, you know, because it's up in the mountains, so it would have been glaciated to some extent. But I guess it remained. There's evidence, I guess, from other kinds of proxies that it remained open, at least for, you know, maybe smaller, but it remained open during the entire transition. So I don't know whether maybe during deglaciation, as we got deeper into last glacial maximum, something happened to sort of turn it off, and so the record just was kind of curtailed a little bit, or maybe it's a circulation thing. I don't know. You would know more about that than me. Yeah, that's another big outstanding question. Why don't they look more alike? Yeah, I don't know.
That makes sense. Yeah, maybe you got.
Do you know anything about circulation around the?
That's kind of outside my time horizon. So, but since you were talking about outcropping, you know, there's perhaps Peruvian upwelling might be another place where it outcrop.
Yeah, right. Yeah, maybe that. Yeah, that's true. Maybe it tells us something about that. That's a good idea.
Yeah, well, any other questions for Carl? I think Carl is going to stick around if anybody wants to chat or talk one-on-one. So let's give Carl a hand.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.
A virtual hand.